Hello, I'm Jim Turk. I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University, and I would like to welcome you to today's program. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the territory in which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. It's also, I want to acknowledge that Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I'm especially excited about today's program because we're beginning a new series entitled Why Whistleblowers Matter. Democracy, after all, while often portrayed as being about law, is really about an unending public discourse regarding what's legitimate and what's not legitimate in a democratic society. And that public discourse can not be brought to an end by a majority at any given point in time in a genuine democracy. While democracy can pass laws, a democratic government can pass laws that we're obligated to follow, it can't stop us from having an ongoing public discourse that actually shapes the boundaries of the democracy. And that in turn depends on the public having a right to know what's going on in its government, what's going on in all aspects of its society. And we have many ways in which we try to ensure that. And these are major concerns of our center, which include press freedom. It's very hard for the public to know without the media. The media are in many ways the public's eyes and ears. We have access to information legislation. It gives us access to information about government. And although our access to information laws in Canada are deeply flawed in many ways, nevertheless, they are an important way in which the public knows things. But you can have all the transparency and all the access to information and press freedom, but many times the only way we in the public get to know what's happening is a result of whistleblowers. These are people who find themselves in situations where they see something of concern that's affecting the public interest that's happening, and they feel the need to make sure that those problems are dealt with. When they can't be dealt with internally, they will either shut up or speak up, and those who speak up are called whistleblowers. And this series is going to be looking at a number of prominent Canadians who didn't set out to be whistleblowers, didn't think that this is what they were ever going to do, but in fact, because they made the decision to speak up, often at considerable personal price they paid or expense themselves, we have come to know things that are very important and can be and have been central to trying to address serious problems affecting the public. So what we're going to do today is I would like to introduce the first of the whistleblowers, a whistleblower whose actions have made a huge difference in our country. And I'm really honored to have her with us today and that we're beginning the program with her. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Michèle Brill-Edwards. Hello, Michèle. Michèle was Health Canada's senior physician responsible for the regulation of clinical drug trials and market approval of prescription drugs. While she was in this position, she grew increasingly aware of undue influence of the pharmaceutical industry and that it was having on drug approval process, sometimes resulting in unreliable decisions endangering human lives. Unable to make changes to these things internally, she ultimately resigned her position and told Canadians what was going on behind the scenes. In our discussion today, we're going to explore what happened, why this matters to all of us, and what can be done. So welcome, Michèle. I'd like to begin, if I may, by just asking you to tell the audience about yourself, your background before you became a senior physician at Health Canada, responsible for clinical trials and market approvals of prescription drugs. And before you do that, I do want to say one other thing to the audience. We'd love for you to join in this conversation. And in this version of Zoom that we have, it's a webinar version, you'll see down at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. The chat function doesn't work in this version, but the Q&A does. So if at any point in my conversation with Michèle, there's questions that come to mind that you would like to ask Michèle, please just click on the Q&A, write out the question. And after our conversation has gone on for a while, maybe 45 minutes, we'll turn to the audience and I'll ask Ann Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression, who's monitoring the Q&A, to ask us the first question, and she'll bring forward each of the questions you put. So please, as questions come to mind, just write them, click on the Q&A button, write them down, and we'll draw you into the conversation. So Michèle, again, if you could start just by telling us a little bit about yourself and your background before you became the senior physician at Health Canada. Where did things begin for you?
Sure, Jim. Thank you. Well, today I'm a happily retired former emergency room pediatrician. But way back when, in ancient times, I was a young kid that wanted to do medicine at a time when women weren't very popular in medicine, and managed to get to the University of Toronto's medical faculty and graduated in '73, and then did a series of positions in various parts of Canada, and ended up in a rural practice doing family medicine when we moved to Ottawa for family reasons. And in 1980, I joined the health protection branch, really not expecting that it would become a career path, more just an interesting option at the time to be involved more in research rather than sole clinical practice. And what I found to my surprise was that this work that was being done in what was then called the Bureau of Human Prescription Drugs within Health Canada was really fascinating. I like trying to solve puzzles, and the puzzles of looking at new information about the early research in prescription drugs is fascinating, and it's challenging, and it's very worthwhile, because you've got to try and figure out whether a new drug is worth the risks. Is it going to work? How is it going to work? When is it going to work? At what dose is it going to work? And in all of those circumstances, is it going to do harm? And they almost all do some form of harm. So you have to be careful, and you have to spell out that information as best you can by looking at the research data. And you were mentioning the right to know. And basically, Canada has a piece of legislation called the Food and Drugs Act, which says that doctors and their patients have the right to know what there is to know about whether a drug works and what the problematic side effects might be before the drug is released on the market in Canada.
So could I just interrupt to ask a question? So if a drug manufacturer comes up with a new drug or a reformulation of an existing drug, before it can be put on the market, it has to go to Health Canada and to the then Health Protection Branch?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and the interesting thing is that that information is given to the Health Protection Branch in confidence. So the doctors who are and scientists who are at Health Canada looking at that research are the only people who have access to that information. So once the drug goes to market, the information will just be the outcome of that examination. The actual data from the research is not made available. Summaries are available, but the what we call the raw data, the real detail of the clinical research, is not made available publicly.
Even after it's been approved?
Even after it's been approved, you just get a summary of what we've decided to make public. And that's certainly true in Canada. It's true in most countries. The US probably makes a little bit more information available, but even there, the actual data sets are not revealed other than in a summary form. It's a little bit like getting the bill at the end of a restaurant meal and it's not itemized. Here it is, you get. So the onus is on the regulatory staff to make sure that they go through that information carefully, and that anything that's really salient information for a doctor to know and a patient to know gets properly described.
So that was that your role in the health prevention branch, to go through the material?
Yes, yeah, it was. As a young doctor, I found it quite a fascinating process. I mean, it's quite solitary in many ways. You're sitting in a little office going through volume after volume of data. But it's a very worthwhile process, because the way I saw it, my 60,000 colleagues across Canada, the physicians in Canada, are relying on people like us to bring forward the accurate information about the drugs.
So if you found a drug that was harmful, I mean, where clearly the harms outweighed any conceivable benefits, Health Canada simply would not license it, and then the drug would not be available.
That's right. And that doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Yeah. Okay. The people tend to think of the approval process as either a red light or a green light. The drug is either approved for market or it's not. But in fact, the work of Health Canada is to make sure that there are lots of flashing orange lights. In other words, almost all prescription drugs have serious side effects. That's why they're characterized as only available through prescription, because they require a learned individual to decide whether it's appropriate to use that product in a particular circumstance. So the role of the regulatory agency in any country is to make sure that the physicians have accurate, complete information, good and bad. Yeah.
So you were there for some period of time. Your job was looking at the research around the particular. The different physicians in the health protection branch staff have responsibility for different drug. In other words, some drugs would be going through and some to others, and then you would make recommendations up the line. Is that?
Yeah, the branch had different areas of responsibility. So there were people working on prescription drugs, on non-prescription drugs, on biologics like blood products and vaccines, on radiopharmaceuticals. So there's quite a wide array of products that need to be scrutinized before they reach the market. Yeah.
You were working on prescription drugs.
I was working primarily on prescription drugs. There were times when we were working on in combination with colleagues in other areas, but yeah, prescription drugs.
So when did you first start having some concerns about the process, the drug approval process that you were undertaking, or that Health Canada, you were helping Health Canada?
Yeah. Initially, you know, as a young doctor there, I was aware that things, you know, didn't always go according to Hoyle, that there were glitches. And I think there are glitches in every system, you know, and so you just sort of think, oh, well, let's hope we can do better next time. And I was really intrigued with the whole process and decided that I wanted to make it my career. And so I went back to get extra training in clinical pharmacology. And to do that, I had to go to a training center. I chose Hospital for Sick Kids in Toronto, and spent 3 years, became a specialist in pediatrics with a subspecialty in clinical pharmacology. And it was really when I came back to the Bureau and started to take on responsibilities at a senior level that I began to realize we were in trouble. My first sort of hint, I guess, was the problems with the AIDS drugs. This was the late 80s when the AIDS crisis was hitting hard, and Canada had done very badly in terms of not making AIDS drugs available. We were the last in the world almost to market the primary drug AZT. We were not making any progress with allowing clinical research to go ahead in Canada. And initially I was not involved, and then suddenly that was handed to me at a moment of crisis, sort of like a live grenade landing in my lap. And my task then I saw as correcting the situation, just getting the show back on the road. And what I realized over time, and by this time I was kind of almost 10 years into my time at Health Canada. So by roughly the late 80s, early 90s, I was realizing that you could clean up an area, you could take a problem that shouldn't have happened and correct the situation, but before long, it would be repeating. So there were recurrent issues where what should be happening in accordance with our statutory duty to uphold the Food and Drugs Act would just simply not be happening. And that came to a head with some of the AIDS drugs, and at the same time, a particular new migraine drug.
Tell us about that and what happened.
Yeah, well, I was aware that most of these problems were occurring because of very substantial influence from the pharmaceutical industry, particular companies with very strong political influence, basically disrupting the normal work of our unit. And when the drug called Imitrex or sumatriptan came along, it was the first in a new class of migraine drugs. So that's a big market and a lot of pressure. And it was actually during a Christmas party, one of the staff in the unit dealing with those drugs came to me and said, I got to talk to you. This is crazy. What's happening? And indeed, it was crazy. The drug had a very serious side effect that would not stop it from going to market, but that needed to be disclosed. And the side effect was that it would cause the arteries of the heart to squeeze down, so the heart would not receive adequate supplies of blood and oxygen, so leading to heart attacks. And we went through the evidence, the data, and there was a particular study that was very straightforward that showed that this was happening. Now, that's the kind of information that by law has to be disclosed in the information that accompanies the approval of the drug and goes to doctors in the field. And I made, a clear representation to the director that this needed to be included, and the drug approval would need to be delayed, perhaps by, at most a couple of days, to get that information into the official documentation. And that was refused. And we made.
What, the director said they wouldn't delay it?
Exactly.
How did he explain that?
Well, there was no need for explanation, because in a hierarchical system, right?
He was the director.
Yeah, exactly. And the difficulty was that I was the senior physician. There was nobody above me that you could appeal to say, look, here's the medical situation. And if push came to shove, and things did go wrong, as the senior physician, I would be the one responsible for not having flagged the issues. So at any rate, at that point, I realized that, this is totally unacceptable.
He explained to you why he was taking that position, or just said, no, I'm sorry, we're not delaying it? We're not going to put this.
There was actually no response to the memos. It was just, silence. Yeah, as they say, radio silence. And the person who was director was only temporarily appointed. And so, the question of what to do, how do you, if this drug goes to market without these warnings, people who don't need to die are going to die, right? So as a doctor, am I on that train? No, I can't go along with that. And as a regulator, it's against the law. Let's be realistic. And the Food and Drugs Act is part of criminal law. So it was very clear that this was not acceptable. And I decided to join an action that was already underway in the federal court.
Oh, that must have been a big decision to join an action against
it was certainly not in the realm of possibility when I began at Health Canada. It just happened that another Health Canada colleague had challenged this temporary appointment.
Your director?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I spoke with the lawyer involved, and he said, it's an administrative challenge. You know, it has a 50-50 chance of succeeding. But if there are safety issues, and if you are willing to give an affidavit to that, then it's a slam dunk.
Mm.
And I thought, well, you know, this can't go on. This has to stop. And the people in the senior levels were showing no interest in changing anything.
Mhm.
So I joined the challenge and we won, and the director was removed by order of the federal court. And in fact, Health Canada removed the director the evening before the court case the following morning in order to avoid publicity. But of course, it garnered tremendous publicity here in Ottawa and really in pharmaceutical circles. So it was a huge, huge black eye for Health Canada. So I knew at that point that I was not their best
Well,
friend.
yeah, what happened to you in the aftermath of this?
Well, in the aftermath, basically, within 6 months, the same director that had been declared unqualified by the court was reappointed by a new process. And my job as senior physician was eliminated from the org chart. I remained at Health Canada, but in a role as simply a reviewer of drug files.
So you were in a sense demoted back to just being a person who looked at.
Yeah, in essence, stay quiet. And at that point, even the lawyer who had won the case said to me, you know, your best bet is to get out of town, Michèle. So it was pretty clear that my career was not going to flourish at Health Canada.
Now, there were other changes going on at Health Canada at that time, as I understand. Wasn't it around then that the name Health Protection Branch was abandoned for another name
Yes,
called the Marketed Health? I wrote this down: the Marketed Health Products Directorate,
yes.
which sounds very corporate and so on, and not as if it's a body that's there to protect the public.
There were a series of name changes at Health Canada, in large part because at that time, the blood scandal was just becoming sort of well known. I think it was the early 90s when the Globe and Mail did their big expose. And suddenly the names that had been used, the Health Protection Branch in particular, were becoming tarnished. And also the policy of deregulation was really taking hold. It had begun in the 1970s, but it was really coming into full force. And the government was eager to negate the obligation of Health Canada to protect the public, and hence the name Health Protection Branch was considered passé, and we got titles that were more and more sort of oblique, that would not relate to anybody, that we actually had a statutory duty to protect the public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. At any rate, I realized, you know, that things had to change for me, and I had been working with the World Health Organization at that time, doing interesting work on AIDS research across the world. And so I won an international competition for a position at World Health Organization, and was actually preparing to go to Geneva to live. And they had thought, well, I've done what I can here. We had started a challenge to the second appointment of the unqualified director, but you know, I thought my path is elsewhere, and to take up that World Health Organization position required for me and for everyone in that position that my government give an endorsement of the appointment. And so I had to seek that from the Deputy Minister of Health, who had, of course, just been really badly embarrassed by the federal court case. At any rate, my meeting with her was very pleasant and interesting initially. You know, oh, Michèle, you know, she welcomed me as kind of a long lost friend. And when I explained why I was there, and she knew why I was there, oh, we're so happy. This is wonderful. This is a lovely appointment for you. Oh, what level is it at? Oh, that's a very good level, and blah, blah, blah. And then she said, well, of course, we would be happy to give our endorsement. And you, in turn, will, I'm sure, be, didn't say happy, but willing to sign a document indicating that you will not reveal that which you have learned in the course of your employment to any outside party, including any legal proceedings.
Hmm.
And that really struck me that, wait a second, this, you are basically saying, if I don't sign this gag order, you're going to block my appointment at the World Health Organization. And basically, this is a get out of town pathway for me. And you're trying to block it because you're so scared of what I might say in the courts. Like, that's when I realized they get it. They know exactly what they've been up to. They know exactly that they've been breaking the law to please the pharmaceutical industry. And more important than getting rid of me, it's to silence me. That's their ultimate goal. And I really thought, I just can't do that. That's anyway, I said to her, I'll think about it. And then I went back the next day, and I think she thought that I was back to capitulate. And instead, I said to her during the course of the discussion, which was not as pleasant as the first day, it's not for me to negotiate for my private gain a matter of public safety. And I could see that her face was like I had just said, I come from the planet Mars. She didn't get it. And she looked at me and she said, but you have a promising career. And that's when I realized that, no, I don't. I am not going to go along with a system that knowingly puts lives at risk and then tries to shut it down and put it behind a secrecy wall. Like that's not who I am. And I realized that was, it was a big decision, but it was not a hard decision. It just, like, it was not possible to go that route. I had the image of myself as walking across the terraza at the World Health Organization building. It's a beautiful marble terraza. It's a illustrious building. And I had the image of walking across it, but walking on the bodies of people who would die because of me accepting that that's what I'll do to get that job. Wow. So that's when I really knew that, okay, this is a whole new ballgame now. And I decided that I would stay at Health Canada and figure out a way to make a lot of this public. And I didn't know what to do for a long time. I struggled with how do you get this information out there? But I just knew that the one rule that I had to follow was don't do nothing. Don't stay silent. Don't allow lives to be lost needlessly for the sake of pharmaceutical profit and political gain. That's not going to happen.
So was it shortly thereafter that another drug came up where there was a lot of controversy?
Yeah, that's right. I watched what was going on and sort of realized after a while that this was not going to get solved from within. And then by chance, I was at a conference in the States with my whole clinical pharmacology sort of professional community when a very stunning research paper was published showing that a drug called short-acting nifedipine was associated with a greater number of deaths than any other drug in the category.
Now, what was this drug for?
Well, it had been approved for one purpose, but then was widely used for a different purpose. So it was approved to treat a condition called angina, which is very severe chest pain arising from the heart that usually portends more heart trouble, like heart attacks and so on. But it was widely used for the purpose of lowering blood pressure. And it was, in fact, at that point, the short-acting form and then longer-acting forms were together the top-selling drugs for high blood pressure.
Well, and it's probably a category of drugs that many people in the audience will know about.
Sure. And it was in a new class called calcium channel blockers. So the old drugs that had worked for years, the diuretics, the beta blockers, were being kind of displaced by this new category of drugs. And nifedipine at that point had been on the market for 10 years. And so it came as a real slap in the face to everyone. And it was evident at the meeting that I was at, because I had all my colleagues from across Canada were immediately saying, this can't be so, this is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wait a sec, guys, we're the scientists. We're the people that are supposed to say, oh, we better look at the data. But nobody was asking for the data. Nobody was saying, well, let's take a look at this. There was this immediate kind of reflex, this has to be wrong. And that's when I sort of thought, well, Health Canada has a big job right now. We have to get hold of that evidence, and we have to look at it carefully, and we have to react. But you're kind of behind the gun or under the gun, I should say, when you're considering the harmful impact of a drug that you've allowed on the market for that long. So governments don't want to admit that they've made a huge mistake. Doctors don't want to admit that they went along with a huge mistake. And the pharmaceutical industry does not want the liability that comes. Like, that is about the only thing that takes down a pharmaceutical firm, is the huge liability that comes with harmful drugs. So the long and short of it was Health Canada did not respond well. And the manner in which they responded became a good example to demonstrate that the loyalty of Health Canada was really to the drug companies and not to the safety of Canadians.
What did they do in the case of the short-acting nifedipine?
Well, the first step was to assign internal staff to review the literature, which is not a bad start, but it ended up that the two individuals just buried themselves in paper. They were not doctors. They had no understanding of how the drugs are used in the field and where the problems might lie. And then the Health Canada established a so-called expert committee. And initially we were told we couldn't participate. So that was a bit of a red flag.
The physicians in the health protection branch couldn't participate?
Right. We weren't even allowed in the room. And then one of the staff really complained loudly. And so the senior people relented and said, well, you can be in the room, but you can't speak. So we at least got to witness what was going on. And
who were the people appointed to the committee to make this?
Well, that's what really, that's what made me realize this is a very important example. You've got a top-selling drug in the world that's under a huge black cloud. And you've got a committee of people there were four cardiologists who treat high blood pressure, and they all had very tight ties to the pharmaceutical industry. But in particular, the chair of the meeting and the cardiologist who was asked to present the data both had extremely tight ties to the industry. And I didn't actually realize the extent of the ties, but it was evident from just the attitude of dismissing very serious side effects that should have been taken more seriously.
Didn't one of them also have direct ties to the manufacturer of the drug?
Yes, I'm saying industry, but both of the two key members had ties to the specific companies making short-acting nifedipine. And one of the companies had a new drug in the same family as nifedipine that they were hoping would take over the market. And in the end, it turned out that that was the goal, was to keep nifedipine on the market so as not to taint the class of drugs, the family of drugs, and therefore allow the newer product to take over the market, which it did. Yeah.
So what happened in the end? Did Health Canada do anything? Were you successful in getting the health protection branch to?
No, the original paper that caused the uproar, that was like front page of the New York Times, that research had occurred in the spring of 1 year, and by the winter of the next year, we still weren't doing anything. Finally, they did put out a Dear Doctor letter, but the letter was very muted. It basically said, don't use the drug, or use, they said use it rarely, if at all. The actual facts of the case showed that the drug should have been withdrawn from the Canadian market in accordance with the Food and Drugs Act. So that whole charade, in my view, was captured on this program done by CBC's Fifth Estate.
Yes, so I had, I actually have had the privilege of seeing that Fifth Estate documentary about all of this, which I understand was shown initially, but then the doctors who had been tied to the industry had gone to get the court to order it to be, order CBC to withdraw it, and were successful. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the when the documentary was aired, I think it aired for three times, like roughly 3 weeks, and then the doctors successfully got an injunction to stop it from being aired, and then there were 2 cases that went to court challenging the CBC, and the CBC lost both cases, but in essence, the subsequent events showed that the CBC was absolutely right in doing the documentary and in airing it. The cases were lost primarily because the court viewed that the documentary was of no public interest and was not in the public interest.
A documentary showing the doctors who were had connections with the company making the drug and decided
that's right,
didn't have to be withdrawn, was not
right.
a public interest.
Yeah. And just to show you what immense public good was done by the documentary and how seriously important the documentary was, in 1998, research was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a very prestigious journal that has very high standards, showing that doctors who receive benefits from the pharmaceutical industry are associated with interpretations of data that favor the companies almost universally. So this was shocking news for many physicians up to that point in Canada and really around the world. Doctors felt that their views, their scientific interpretations of data could not be influenced, and there would be righteous indignation if you suggested it. How dare you suggest that I might be influenced by blah, blah, blah. And this was research in one of the best journals in the world saying, no, guys, we got it wrong. We are definitely influenced in our thinking, in our interpretation of scientific data. And that changed the ethical approach to benefits received from the pharmaceutical industry, certainly in North America, and I would say around the world.
But now, in the midst of all this, your position at Health Canada must have been pretty tenuous. What did you do?
Well, it was a bit of a cat and mouse game. I realized that I would have to resign if this documentary was to be completed and shown. I ought not to be there. But on the other hand, I had to make sure that there was enough information available to the documentary makers to have a reliable and fully informed documentary. So yes, it was, I think, tenuous understates the circumstances. When I finally did leave, I basically tiptoed out, quite literally, while there were security guards hired by the branch to monitor who was leaving the building at what times and with what documentation.
So you stayed in the job until Fifth Estate was able to get the story to be
What they needed, yes, yeah.
So essentially you gave up your career with them in order for the
Mhm.
public to be informed about what was going on.
Yes, to me it was important. Yeah,
Yes, well,
it was, these are situations that make you decide who you are and make you realize that, like, am I going along with this? I don't know. A friend, Arthur Schaefer, the ethicist in Manitoba, said to me at one point, he said, Michelle, people treat this as a big ethical dilemma, but really it was no dilemma, was it? And I said, absolutely not. No, it was like, I didn't give a moment's thought to going along with what they were doing.
but it still was a big step for you because suddenly you were out of this well-paying job.
Yeah.
What happened immediately after? I mean, you left, you were no longer employed there.
Right.
As you had done what you had done, CBC was able to air this documentary
Mhm.
exposing what was actually going on in the
Yeah.
health protection branch.
Yeah, a documentary that led to the kind of change that I was, indicating was needed. But you're right. The tumultuous period that I went through and my family went through in the aftermath of that was astounding. Like I look back and I'm amazed that we went through it, that we got through it. There was hell to pay. The politicians wanted to know what was going on. The media wanted to know. There was just relentless tumult in our lives.
And were you able to get work?
Well, no. I mean, once you blow the whistle in any matter relating to the pharmaceutical industry, work is going to be difficult. I was very fortunate that I was still qualified with an active license and so on. And in the first few years, I knew I was blacklisted, and I just thought we can live for a while without an income. And it was more important to me to keep the alarm bells ringing. So I worked pretty much relentlessly with anyone who was concerned about drug safety. And so I worked with individuals and groups trying to bring forward the damage that was being done by Health Canada's dereliction of duty to uphold the Food and Drugs Act. And so I worked a lot with the blood injured parties at the Creever inquiry, with people like Dr. Nancy Oliveri, under the gun because of trying to speak up about Apotex's drug deferiprone. Worked with military people who were concerned about mefloquine. I worked with a lot of the members of parliament and people who had constituents who were having problems. The overall impact was that although I was really busy and the alarm bells were ringing louder and louder, we were without income, and that was difficult. Eventually, by about 1998, things were settling down. The Creever report had come out really slamming Health Canada and showing that the blood scandal was in large part due to their dereliction of duty to regulate blood. The New England Journal article had come out showing that, of course, conflict of interest is a major issue in medical research and it needs to be better addressed. A lot of the stories, the Oliveri story was front page at that point. And one of my colleagues at the local children's hospital here in Eastern Ontario said to me, Michelle, basically you've been vindicated. And Maclean's, for example, had run 2 successive articles about how wrong things were at the Health Protection Branch. And so I applied to have my privileges to work there reinstated. But unfortunately for me, the head of pediatrics at that point was very tightly tied to Health Canada. And so that didn't happen. And then in 1999, we went through, I think, the worst year of our lives. There were the 2 court cases. And that was the year that my mom died, in no small part because of the stress that we had been living under. And it just, you start to think, wow, this is awful. And then at the end of that year, by chance, a job opportunity became available in Toronto, working in Dr. Oliveri's unit. Oh. And that was the lifeline. And so I took that job for about 1.5 years, traveled from Ottawa to Toronto weekly to do that work. And then eventually I came back to Ottawa, and the atmosphere at the Children's Hospital had altered, and I was back on, working there as a pediatrician in the emergency department. And so I kept working, helping people, anybody that wanted to know how the system works. I would do that, but I think that was our salvation, really. Yeah.
Were there some others in Health Canada who had concerns similar to yours who spoke up at the time?
There were, and I think it speaks to an important part of whistleblowing. In order to take a stand, it takes a community. So individuals by themselves can't undertake this type of public service action alone. The obvious ones at the time were the veterinarians who spoke up about bovine growth hormone, the milk hormone. And I had resigned at the time when they were before the Senate under intense scrutiny, and they were forbidden to speak because of the secrecy of Health Canada's rules. So I would be chatting with them, Shiv Chopra, Margaret Hayden, Gerard Lambert, the late Chris Basuda, to find out what was going on, what was really happening. And then I could speak to the press because I was no longer at Health Canada. So it was kind of a duo, tag team, and it was very helpful. There was, prior to that, years earlier, where there was Pierre Blais, who had blown the whistle on breast implants, and he was extremely supportive and very helpful in terms of telling me what to anticipate next. And there was a friend, George Nell, a scientist from the Drug Research Bureau that had been shut down during this period of deregulation. And so the media would call me and say, what do you know about drug X, or, and medical device Y? And so I would call George and say, George, who do we know that knows about, this food or that drug? And he's a lovely man. He had kept in touch with all his old buddies. And so we had all these people popping up, some officially and some anonymously, but really helping everyone to understand what was going on. I think that group single-handedly was responsible for keeping the food research labs in operation when the government had decided to shut them down. Yeah. Well,
I mean, your story is one illustration back of what we began with, of how the public has a right to know, but yeah, they have government departments like Health Canada that has secrecy rules and non-disclosure agreements and so on that prevent the public from knowing about matters that can be of life and death.
Absolutely. It ought not to be allowed. It's archaic. I mean, the whole notion of that you must be loyal to the minister is really archaic. It goes back to being loyal to the king. Our loyalty, in my mind, as public servants, is to our fellow citizens. not to the minister as a person. It's to the minister as the representative of a government who is there to safeguard their health, right? So if the minister wants to tell lies, we have no obligation of loyalty to that. That is decadent loyalty, and that's wrong. But I think the real answer to all of this is to stop the secrecy, to have a culture that says, no, 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 no. We will not operate on the basis of blind trust. So secrecy is out the window. We want to know what's going on.
Well, and at the time this was all going on, Canada had no protection for whistleblowers.
None.
The government in 2006 brought in the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, which was allegedly to protect whistleblowers.
Yep.
And you may have seen the International Bar Association and the Government Accountability Project, the largest whistleblower protection organization in the world based in the United States, did a ranking of, I think it was 40 some countries' whistleblower protection law. And this protection that's been brought in since your time would have afforded you nothing, because we have the worst whistleblower protection legislation in the world. We're tied with Lebanon for the worst in the world.
You're absolutely right. In fact, if my circumstances of that era arose today, I would have been in a worse situation, because I would have been compelled to go first to the people who were the problem. So whereas in that era, without a law, I could resign and go to the media, right? But under today's law, that's not allowed. You have to disclose everything to the people who are part of the wrongdoing, who then get to fire you for whatever reason they can create. And you know, it really it's a terrible system. Our colleague David Hutton and I went to intervene with the early commissioner of the first system under the new legislation, and I mean, it was clear from the get-go that whistleblowers were not going to be welcome with complaints under the new legislation.
Well, and I'm afraid that's proven the case. Why don't we turn to the audience now and give them a chance to join our conversation, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Ange, what's the first question that you have from the audience?
Yeah, I do want to remind attendees that they can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask questions to Michèle and Jim. The first question is from Neri, and Neri asks, is there still corrupt practices in approving drugs today in Canada? I feel that the pharmaceutical companies are teaching our physicians to dispense drugs for treatments rather than doing preventative medicine.
Yes, the short answer is yes. And the term corruption needs to be qualified, because it is the system which has been weakened, and that to my way of thinking is a form of corruption of the protection of the public, but it is not officially breaking the rules. And I should explain that in days gone by, the requirement was that to get a drug to market, you had to first do the research necessary to demonstrate, that's the word used under the law, demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the product, right? In today's world, after, what is it now, about 3-4 decades of deregulation, you now, under the rules, are allowed to take a drug to market without having that evidence available. So you have preliminary evidence that shows maybe the drug works and maybe it's safe. And then you promise to do, the companies promise to do further research, and the drug goes to market and can stay on the market until that evidence is acquired. That is, the studies are done and interpreted, and there's problems that arise. But the record shows there's a vast array now of information available that the companies promise to do the research and then never do it, and Health Canada does very little about it. Myself and another colleague, Joel Lechkin, have each written chapters in a new forthcoming book that will be published this year on deregulation in Canada. And we've written about how the regulations have been weakened to the point where the public is at risk because of the lack of requirement to actually make adequate, accurate information known to doctors through the official information that goes with a drug when it is approved.
I mean, I think your initial point, Michelle, is so correct. I mean, in some ways, if corruption were the problem, that would be less serious, because that suggests that you have a well-functioning system and you're paying somebody off to get around it.
Mm-hmm.
Here, the system itself is.
Yes. The political policy espoused by both ruling parties in Canada has created a weakened, I would say, corrupted system, but it is lawful.
Right. Okay, Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Edgar. And Edgar says, the first part of this is not a question. I just want to express my admiration and thanks for what you did and your clarity in communicating it. As for the question, I wonder whether you think there is an effective way to change the misplaced loyalty to which you refer, loyalty to ministers and managers rather than to the public.
I think there is a way, but it's not simple. People in today's world, I think, are more and more aware that we don't always get the straight goods from our elected officials. I think the time is right for for people working in the public interest to create a cultural shift, to start saying, we don't accept this. Who will lead that charge? I think the public agencies would include the unions, would include the nonprofits, would include the academic centers like Ryerson. We need a conversation to start talking about why we have all this secrecy, why we allow this culture of decadent loyalty to persist. It is archaic. It's doing tremendous public harm. So I think we need more stories. We need more whistleblowers, and we need the attention of the public. And when I speak to groups, I try to get across this notion that, yes, we need whistleblowers, but we need a community that supports whistleblowers. And when information comes to light that government is not acting in the interests of citizens, we need everybody to say, hey, wait a sec, that's not right. So that even if all you do is talk to your neighbor across the fence and say, did you hear about such and such? That's not acceptable. Then that's a step ahead. And everybody has a role to play. Everyone, all citizens have a role to play in supporting open, honest government with people of integrity being safe to speak publicly.
Okay, Ange, another question?
Yeah, a question actually that's come in from a few people. So I'm going to just combine them into one. This next question, many people who are wrestling with the decision of whether to be vaccinated are deeply affected by justifiable mistrust of the pharmaceutical industry. What would you say to them, and what do you know about the approval process for vaccinations?
First of all, I want to say that I myself probably fall into the vaccine hesitant category. I am fully COVID vaccinated with third dose. All my family is, everybody I know is. I've spent a lot of time trying to help family members that are vaccine hesitant to understand that in these circumstances, probably on a balance of probabilities, your best bet is to be vaccinated. But the secrecy under which vaccines are approved begets distrust.
Mhm.
So why is it that I, as a doctor, can't see the data upon which these decisions are being made? And for example, when I speak to my colleagues who are on the vaccine committees and challenge them and say, have you looked at the data? And they say, no, we're not allowed to see it. And I say, no, you are allowed to see it. I've been at Health Canada. You would not be refused. But they believe they are not allowed to see it, and nobody offers them. And so we have a circumstance where we really can't view the raw data, the important detailed data that answers very particular questions. So I can tell you how I handled that. When the vaccines were first being developed, I held my breath. When they were approved, I held my breath. I watched very carefully all the information that was made publicly available. I took my hat off to the German agency that was the first to pick up on the very serious brain clots that were associated with one of the vaccines. So, but I wasn't first in line. So with my background and my expert knowledge, even I was saying, let's hang on here, let's see what goes on. And we weren't offered the vaccine as I was no longer a frontline worker in healthcare. I was retired. By the time my age group was allowed to have the vaccine, I was ready to say, okay, we seem to be past the first few months. Usually with vaccines, if there are going to be really serious side effects, they'll be within the first couple of months. And so I made the calculated guess that it was better to try the vaccine and to take that risk rather than not. At that point, people were dying around the world. It was a different equation than whether you want other vaccines for lesser serious illnesses. But I'm the first to accept and to empathize with well-informed people who are not crazy. They're not, anti-government agitators. They're normal, ordinary citizens who are just saying, why would I have to trust this kind of secret system? It's the secrecy that creates the mistrust. And that's a big part of why I think we need to get rid of secrecy, because we can't afford this level of mistrust. The pharmaceutical industry has been shown repeatedly to put profit ahead of safety. That's like not even debatable anymore. Do they do it in every instance? No, but they do it often enough that we have to be on the lookout for it. So we need data to be openly available, and we need people who are well qualified with a sense of healthy skepticism to be able to examine those data. Then we'll have a lot less vaccine hesitancy. But until then, we'll be in trouble.
Thank you, Michelle. Ange, another question?
Yeah, the next question. Do you know how intellectual property plays a part in the drug approvals? Would this be the reason why certain information isn't being shared?
Intellectual property is the most important aspect of drug research and drug marketing in countries around the world. The issue can't be overstated. That said, the law says that intellectual property cannot become more important than human health and safety. So the pharmaceutical industry would have you believe that information, is private and cannot be shared and blah, blah, blah. Not so. If it is important to the safety of the public, the Minister of Health has the authority to make that information public. They just don't. They don't use that authority. They allow the companies to get away with what they get away with, keeping everything secret. Safety trumps profit.
Ange, another question.
Yeah, the next question is from Sandy, and Sandy says, Michelle, thank you for all you've done to protect Canadians. What would you like to see to prevent what happened to you from happening again?
Short answer, robust whistleblower protection legislation. The US has some fairly good legislation. Canada's, as Jim mentioned, is almost the worst in the world. It's certainly the worst in the developed world. And it's unnecessary. We don't need legislation that protects the system of secrecy. We need the opposite. So I would encourage everybody who's listening, you know, in any way, no matter how big or small, advocate for whistleblower protection.
You know, and if I just could add, not only is what you just suggested really important, the challenge is formidable in Canada. When the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act was brought in 2006, there were enough questions about it that Parliament imposed a mandatory 5-year review. And the Harper government resisted that, and finally, after it was voted out of office, the Liberal government came in, and they didn't immediately begin the review. And then actually, I got a call from someone to say that the Government Operations Committee of the House of Commons had just been asked to review the whistleblower legislation out of the blue. It turns out, my hypothesis is that the Prime Minister's office wanted to get them off a certain investigation they were doing, so gave them this task. And they were dumbfounded. A friend of mine was the vice chair of that committee. And I called him and I said, are you prepared for this? He said, no, we learned about this on a Thursday from the Liberal members of our committee, and we're to begin hearings on Monday. And the integrity commissioner, who's head of this deeply flawed process, is our one witness. And I said, what would it be helpful if the center connected you with other experts in Canada? And they said, yes, we'd be delighted. So I got in touch with David Hutton, who you've mentioned before, and is a senior fellow now at the center, who's one of the leading authorities on whistleblower protection in Canada. And he and some other colleagues appeared before them. And then some of the leading experts from around the world appeared before them. And the committee came up with a deeply troubling assessment of the current whistleblower protection. They really named the problems. And what was surprising for a parliamentary committee was that the recommendations for the fundamental changes that needed to be made were passed unanimously, including by the government members of the committee. So we were all hopeful in our naive state. Well, that will mean the government will have to do something about it. This was, I think, in 2017 or 18, and nothing happened for 9 months. Whistleblower protection is under the aegis of the president of the Treasury Board, and Scott Bryson was the president at the time. And so about 6 or 8 months later, he came and met with the committee and thanked them profusely for their very valuable contribution, and nothing's been heard of it since. And unless until there's public pressure to do something about this, the government has no incentive. Whistleblower protection is something lots of governments lots of parties in opposition think is great until they become the government, and then they discover, well, actually, secrecy and lack of transparency works better for us. And one of the things we do with these programs the center does is we put up a video of them on our website and on our YouTube channel, but we also put with them some resources, and we'll put the link to this Government Operations Committee report recommending fundamental changes to it and some other material for those who are listening. But you're absolutely right. Until we get better whistleblower protection, and ours is literally the worst in the world of the 40-some countries that were studied. So Ange, do you have another question?
No, I do want to remind people, if there's more clarification on questions, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, but otherwise not currently at the moment, Jim. Okay.
So Michelle, to wrap up, you've talked about what some of the things that need to be done. One is absolutely better whistleblower protection. Is there anything you'd say to colleagues in the wherever they are, in government or in the private sector, who see wrongdoing. Do you have any thoughts or advice for them?
Yeah, I think it's for people who are struggling with what to do. I think the most important piece that I've learned is don't do nothing. But in addition, I think it's very important to seek community, to find people who share the concerns that you're trying to deal with, and to be careful about how you approach the issue of bringing forward the information that the public needs to have. The process of disagreeing with government decisions or government policy is a treacherous one, in the sense that government employees are fully vulnerable to all kinds of unfair actions on the part of the employers. The senior staff are very committed to upholding the image of the government, the image that ministers of the government want to have portrayed publicly. And so you need a plan, you need to know what you're up against. I remember being told early on, your best bet is just a brown envelope. In other words, don't reveal who you are. That's a good strategy if you have a simple issue that could be well understood by a single few documents. If you're in a complicated technical area, that simply is not going to work, because there's very few people that would understand the nature of what your concerns are. I think that it's extremely difficult right now for anyone to bring forward unwelcome information, in large part because we have not had any whistleblowers for quite some time at the federal level or the provincial level. And so the public is sort of being lulled back into the impression that all is well, there's no problem. And the whole notion of loyalty and secrecy is kind of not sort of top of mind in the public awareness.
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely true. And our whole discussion today has been primarily around whistleblowing in the public sector. Those in the private sector are without virtually any legal protection. And one of the things our center is doing is looking at legislation in other parts of the world. There's some good legislation in a few states in Australia, for example, that provide whistleblower protection for those in the private sector, because you could be working in a meat plant, packing plant, or a automobile manufacturing plant, or a steel mill, or a variety of private sector situations where you see public harm that could be done. Yeah. And speak out, and you're absolutely without protection currently in Canada, and that can be changed. And there are good examples of legislation that makes that kind of change real.
I think too, Jim. Yeah, that's absolutely true. The private sector is in an even worse situation. I think that there's a very important public policy that has allowed tremendous abuse of systems to protect the public, whether it's health safety or workplace safety or transportation safety. And that is the policy of deregulation. And I think that if we want substantial, significant sort of improvement in the government's preparedness to do the work of safeguarding the public, we need to reverse that policy. We have come to the point where it's not illegal to let profits override safety. Like, how bad is that? I mean, that in any democracy, that should not be acceptable. But worldwide, pretty well in all the G20 countries, that is a policy that's well underway. So if somebody internally says, hey boss, this is going to kill people unnecessarily. It's kind of like, yeah, well, you know, we have come to a point in public discourse where protection of the public is just rhetoric. What everybody knows is that in the real world, it's, you know, protection of profits that carry the day. I think even if we as a community of interested citizens start to change our rhetoric, start to say this is wrong if safety does not trump profits anymore. Like even our attitude will in a way carry forward and help the change occur. It goes back to the lesson I learned, don't do nothing. You may not win, you may not succeed in what you're trying to do, but if you're trying to do what's right, then even if your efforts fail, other people will join in. Other people will say, aha, that's a problem that needs to be addressed. In my case, I had no idea that the documentary that the CBC was doing would trigger milestone research that would change medical ethics across the board. But it did. And I think that sometimes you just have to have that attitude, do what's right, don't do nothing, carry on, do your best, and then you have to let the chips fall where they may.
Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do have another question from Alex. Alex says, Michelle, I wonder if you saw the recent statements by the World Health Organization, including the following, and if so, if this gives you any concern, knowing these individuals are often not medically trained. The statement is the fifth priority is to urgently strengthen the World Health Organization as the leading and directing authority on global health at the center of the global health architecture.
That's an interesting question, because perhaps more than most of my colleagues, I know the power for good that is wielded by the World Health Organization. But I've also seen the political influence that is played out in the World Health structure or system. So do I agree with that statement? There's a part of me that does agree with it. There's a part of me that says, weak as the World Health Organization can be at times, it is still a whole lot better than not having a World Health Organization. The amount of straightforward, real corruption and distress and suffering that goes on in third world countries, or developing countries, I should say, is really troubling. And the World Health has been the only force that worldwide that has been able to come to any help with, you know, the state of medicine in developing countries. Are they perfect? Not by a long shot. Is there political influence that shouldn't be there? Absolutely. Does the pharmaceutical industry have sway at World Health? Yes, they do. I would say our challenge is to make the World Health Organization be true to its intended purpose, rather than to dismiss it as an agency that does make mistakes.
Okay, well, thank you, Michelle. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you wanted to share before we wrap up?
One thing that really strikes me, the more we speak, people tend to hear about all this and think, oh my God, this is an intractable situation. You know, let's just go have supper and not think about it. And I think it's important not to look at the horror story that happened to me and say, oh my God, this is unchangeable. It's important to say, you know what, good can come from all this. Yeah, I lost my career and my family suffered. My mother died, but in no small part, she endorsed what I was doing. And very positive change has come. So I would encourage people to look at the glass half full. We are in a lot better situation today to demand that, for example, that doctors with tight ties to the pharmaceutical industry don't get to make decisions about drug safety. I think that's a real step ahead. So yeah, it's a messy process. The system is very unfair, but we can't just lie down and do nothing. One time, it was 1995, my mom was still alive, and the 50-year anniversary of the end of the Second World War was coming up, and she had lived in London, on the outskirts of London throughout the war, and knew the horror that the English faced. She had a Dutch war bride who had lived similarly in Holland, and I was asking them, you want to go down to the celebrations? And they were like, no, not really. I couldn't understand. Finally, I said to Mom, like, is there something that, we've forgotten, or maybe we don't even know, that you guys are not at all celebratory? Like, everybody is like going crazy for this celebration of the winning of the war 50 years ago. And she said to me, Michèle, nobody understands today that we didn't win because we were on the side of right. We could have easily lost. Hitler was armed to the teeth. At the outset of the war, we thought we were doomed. And I said, well, then, like, why did you fight? And she said, well, we couldn't just lie down and let them kill us. And it really taught me a lesson that you don't just give up because it's going to be a hard fight. You don't just give up because it's easier to go and forget about it and do something else. You really have to sort of say, if something is important, if we need change that's going to benefit the whole of society, then we better get at it. We better get busy. We better do the work, and we have to stay sane in the meantime. You can't sort of, you have to keep it as a hobby in a sense. You still have to, like, put bread on the table, keep a roof over your head, be kind to your neighbors, enjoy life a bit, but don't dismiss the task. It is possible to make change for the better.
Well, I can't think of a better point at which to end our conversation. Michèle, it's been a real honor for me to be able to have this conversation with you.
I'm grateful for the chance, Jim. Thanks.
And I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. A video of this interview or this conversation will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow. Our website address is cfe.ryerson.ca. It will also be posted on our YouTube channel. And as well, we'll post, as I said earlier, resources that you can look at if you want to see more about that. A link to the report of the Government Operation Committee on Canada's present whistleblowing law, some reference to other materials to which Michèle has discussed. The Center for Free Expression website has a lot of resources for people who are in situations where they are concerned about what's happening and may want to blow the whistle. So if you go to our website and just click on issues whistleblowing, there are a whole host of documents and guides and other things to provide advice. And we also provide a service if you find yourself in a difficult situation and want some assistance in terms of someone to talk with and explore options, please get in touch with the center. Again, cfe.ryerson.ca. So our next event is going to be a different one. We're starting another new series. So we're going to continue having these conversations with prominent Canadian whistleblowers. So this was the first, and we're honored that Michèle was the inaugural person for this series. But we're going to have some really interesting people further on, and we'll, if you're interested in being informed about upcoming events, you can either just check our website or go onto our website and ask to go on the email list where we'll let you know about upcoming events. The new series we're starting on March 2nd, so not next week, but the following week on Wednesday, March 2nd. is a series entitled Threats to Press Freedom. And we're going to be looking at challenges to press freedom around the world and domestically. We're starting with around the world first, and the panel discussion we're going to have is entitled Silencing Kashmir, the state of press freedom in the world's most militarized zone. The Indian government has taken some of the most repressive measures to silence the media. And so we're going to have some Kashmiri journalists, and the panel is going to be moderated by one of the truly outstanding Canadian journalists who has extensive international experience as well, and a former senior producer for the CBC's Fifth Estate, Julian Scher. So I hope you'll be interested in joining us on March 2nd, Wednesday, March 2nd. It'll be, because some of the journals are in India or in Kashmir, it'll be at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and the details are on our website. Thank you very much for attending today, and I hope to see you at future events. Bye-bye.